It's absolutely ridiculous for anybody to suggest that under the process that we're advocating that somehow you're giving away your vote. There's no discretion at all involved in the process that we are putting forward. My colleague sat through hours of hearings yesterday.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of the rule in the underlying bills. Madam Speaker, my office in Miami is not getting calls. We're getting cries for help. My neighbors are scared of both a virus that could kill them or their loved ones and worried about how they will make their next rent or mortgage payment or buy groceries, or when their children will go back to school. Today we vote on two bills. The first will allow members of Congress to do our jobs as described. The second will provide desperately needed relief. We have already passed 4 pieces of legislation to respond to the pandemic, which has killed more than 83,000 Americans. My friends and neighbors in South Florida are suffering. The HEROES Act gives money to my state, cities, and county that are shouldering both the economic and health burdens of COVID-19. Unless we do this, my county and cities and school board will not be able to pay teachers or firefighters or police officers or transit workers or even hire contract tracers to help get this virus under control. This bill provides that, including more money for SNAP, additional economic impact payments of up to $6,000 per family. The HEROES bill also provides needed funding for the Postal Service. The Postal Service was founded in 1792. It's more critical than ever in helping people safely access medications and food and cleaning supplies and vote by mail ballots and more. While the Senate may be here in D.C. whistling past the graveyard as they confirm judicial nominees, we are working to get the American people the help they desperately need. I urge all of my colleagues to support these bills, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to my good friend, distinguished gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, member of both the Rules Committee and the Judiciary Committee.
Gentlelady is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative Cole. Both bills under this rule are absolutely terrible and should be rejected. First of all, you have the proxy voting and remote voting. This has never been done in the history of the United States, not during the Civil War, not during previous pandemics, and we shouldn't do it now. When you have nurses going to work, when you have grocery store workers going to work, when you have everybody else going back to work, we are setting a terrible example by saying, you don't have to show up to work, just give your voting card over to somebody else. It's terrible. And then when I offered an amendment in rules yesterday saying, okay, if you don't show up to work, you don't get the travel allowance in your MRA. And that was rejected by every single Democrat member on the Rules Committee. And then Pelosi's bill, I call it the Keep People Unemployed Act, because that's what it is. It will incentivize people to stay unemployed. It extends the $600 a week unemployment payment for through January 31st of next year. It mandates all businesses continue the Family Medical Paid Leave Act for another year. And it says that when you apply for SNAP food stamps, that the $600 a week that you're getting doesn't count towards income. So now you're going to have people that are sitting at home getting paid more than they did when they worked and getting food stamps. I already have businesses in my district that say, we need to hire back these people because Arizona's back open. They can't hire the people because the people are getting paid more to sit at home. In addition, it gives $1,200 to people that are here illegally. Why are we not prioritizing U.S. citizens? It lets criminals that are convicted of murder and rape just because they're 50 years old or older out of prison. And it federalizes elections, mandating that there's same-day voter registration and that everyone is mailed a ballot. This is a ridiculous bill in this combined rule, and I ask my members to vote no. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Speaker, there's a lot that I could say, but let me just say this. In the time of this incredible, tragic health pandemic and economic crisis, I don't think now is the time to kick poor people, to beat up on people who are hungry in this country. We ought to step forward as the United States of America, the richest country in the history of the world, and make sure that nobody in our country goes hungry. It's shameful the way my colleagues on the other side of the aisle demagogue this issue. It is shameful.
Gentleman's recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the underlying rule and of the HEROES Act to provide stimulus checks to all taxpayers. In April, I introduced 6438, the Leave No Taxpayer Behind Act, so that hardworking, tax-paying immigrants who work in our fields to feed us on an everyday basis, also receive stimulus checks. Thank you for including this measure in the HEROES Act, and I urge passage of the HEROES Act, and I yield back.
Madam Speaker, and thank you to Ranking Member Cole. I rise today to speak in opposition to the underlying legislation on H-Res 965. The process that has led to this debate is unacceptable. After a previous failed attempt to bring similar rules change package to the floor last month, I was hopeful that the work of a bipartisan task force to reopen the House would result in genuine willingness toward bipartisan solutions. I was optimistic that our Democratic majority would partner with us to help this body adapt to the coronavirus pandemic. We Republicans on that task force offered a realistic framework to make responsible, measured, and thorough reforms to get the whole House working again. That plan was dismissed out of hand by the Democratic majority with no alternative. It was not until Wednesday morning, just 2 days ago, with the release of H-Res 965 that we saw any semblance of a plan, and in no way was it a product of bipartisanship or greater member input. The majority's unwillingness to work in a collaborative way was reinforced yesterday at the Rules Committee hearing when not one common sense amendment offered by the minority was accepted. Common sense amendments like requiring the technology used by the House to be certified by the CAO, rejected. Requiring technical support during virtual committee activity, rejected. Allowing the entire House of Representatives to weigh in on the type of remote voting this body follows, rejected. Not only is this resolution completely partisan, it's being rushed to the floor while there are still an unacceptable amount of unanswered questions, both on the specifics of the process is authorized and the rules changes, and the technology to support it. I know that this morning at 6 a.m. we were provided a copy of the regulations that the Rules Committee plans on issuing. Is that the same type of consultation that we can expect for the remote hearing changes that are left to one member of the majority to decide? The House is on the receiving end of 1.6 billion unauthorized scans on our network per month. After broadcasting to the world that members are going to now be able to cast their vote or operate in this institution remotely, I don't know about you, Madam Speaker, but I expect those to increase. What further reduces my confidence in these sweeping changes that will not have their stated effect is the feedback from virtual committee roundtables that have already been attempted by every committee. There have been instances, the majority staff kicking participants off video conferences because they had not RSVP'd. And while I have some time, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a list of the concerns that our ranking members have provided me on the House Administration Committee.
Without objection.
Thank you. Members' personal information on these roundtables already have been viewed publicly. Members being dropped from platforms because of poor connections. Members being unable to participate in web-based events due to poor internet connections in rural areas. And the list goes on. I mention these examples not to say that all virtual proceedings cannot or should not be authorized, but I share these issues as further proof that the crawl, walk, run approach is necessary to make virtual proceedings, make sure that they're done successfully. In closing, I'd like to reiterate what I shared to the Rules Committee hearing yesterday. I want to encourage all of us to take a step back. I want to make sure that we don't have precedent that is set that will create a brand new process. We're not here simply debating an outdated rule, Madam Speaker. We are here debating what kind of institution we want the People's House to be and the example that we want to set for the American people and the rest of the world. If we vote to adopt HRES 965, we are setting a new precedent that will forever change the processes that we are used to in the House of Representatives. It opens the Pandora's box. It provides constitutional risks. And in times of crisis, America should trust their leaders. Vote no on HRES 965. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, Madam Speaker, I'm disappointed with the gentleman's statement. He referred to a failed attempt 3 weeks ago to deal with the issue of remote voting. There's no failed attempt. We pulled the bill to have discussions with the Republicans about how we can move forward. That's why we did this. And then the gentleman refers to all these amendments that were brought up in the Rules Committee, common sense amendments. Yeah, amendments on everything, including abortion, immigration, airline travel. But the gentleman knows full well that many of the suggestions that the Republicans offered during our negotiations, we took into account and are part of this proposal. So I don't know what the gentleman's talking about, but I will tell you this. That kind of attitude, that commentary, doesn't bode well for future negotiations. At this time, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
In all of our bills, virtually all the money goes to bandage the economic wounds. We need a greater focus on beating the disease. Workers need paid sick days so they'll stay home if they're sick, even if they work for an employer with under 50 or over 500 employees. The Defense Production Act needs to be amended so it can provide for the licensing of new technology, and inventors need to be well compensated if they invent something useful to attack the COVID virus. We've provided money for testing, but only 0.25% of the money we provide in this bill or prior bills has gone for therapeutics, prophylaxis, and vaccines. The clinical medical researchers of this country are sitting at home because virtually all non-COVID medical research has been suspended. Let's put them to work. Let's learn more of the basic facts of COVID, and let's test every reasonable combination of generic compounds at every stage of the disease. Yes, for a while we can bind our economic wounds, but ultimately we need to beat the disease. I yield back.
Yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to my good friend, distinguished gentleman from Ohio, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the
Gentleman's
gentleman.
recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Madam Speaker, 3 weeks ago, the Attorney General of the United States said this: the Constitution is not suspended during a crisis. Amen to that. And guess who agreed with you? Or at least you used to agree with you. Last month, April 9th, the Speaker of the House said there is a constitutional requirement we vote in person, but oh, how that has changed. Today, we are in fact suspending the Constitution. We're allowing proxies to establish a quorum and do the business of the American people. The Supreme Court's been very clear in this. In the Ballin decision, court said members have to be present. Quote, the Constitution requires the presence of a majority, and when that majority is present, the power of the House arises. You got to be there. You got to be here. You got to be here to do the business of the people. You can't phone it in. You can't mail it in. You can't give 10 proxies. This bill would allow 10 proxies, one member to have 10 proxies in their back pocket. Think about that. 22 members with 10 proxies in their back pocket could do the business of 330 million people in this great country. We all take an oath to the Constitution. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution mandates that Congress must, quote, assemble at least once a year. That's when we start the session. Article 1, Section 5 requires Congress to physically congregate and vote to change where it's going to sit. Frankly, what's happening today. Section 5 also requires a recorded vote on any question at the desire of 1/5 present. Article 1, Section 6 mandates and protects members from arrest during travel to and from their attendance at a session of their respective house. You'd think if you could mail in your vote, the Constitution wouldn't protect you on traveling to the vote. All these provisions envision members physically traveling and being present at the federal seat, at the seat of the federal government. As Ms. Lesko said earlier, farmers are planting crops, truckers are moving goods, grocers are stocking shelves, frontline healthcare workers haven't missed a day. They can't phone it in. They can't mail it in. They can't proxy their work in. They have to be there and do it. And we should do the same. The example this sends, the precedent this sets, is so darn wrong. And I encourage a no vote on H.R. 965. With that, I yield back to the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, Madam Speaker, let me respond. That's not worth it. Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Pappas.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of the HEROES Act today because our frontline workers, first responders, and community members are rising to the occasion, and so must Congress. We know we are living through an unprecedented crisis, and if we fail to redouble our efforts, the public health threat will grow, more jobs will be permanently lost, additional small businesses will throw in the towel, and cities and towns will go bust. The conversations I have every day with mayors and hospital officials, small business owners, and essential workers underscore why bold action is immediately needed. I fought for a number of provisions in this bill that are important to my constituents, including aid to local government to sustain essential services, free coronavirus testing and treatment and vaccines for low-income individuals, expanded tax credits for small businesses to keep workers on the job, and giving our veterans a reprieve from VA debt collection. No bill is perfect, but with bipartisan cooperation in the coming days, we can deliver meaningful results. We can meet this moment responsibly, ensure our communities are equipped to overcome this virus, and allow our economy to safely get back on its feet. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, if we defeat the previous question, I'll offer an amendment to the rule to change to 2/3 the threshold required to pass H.Res. 965. The resolution changing the rules of the House to adopt a proxy voting procedure on the floor and to allow remote proceeding. Madam Speaker, changing the rules actually does require a 2/3 vote, and that's what we're doing in this rule. Madam Speaker, the rules change that H.Res. 965 contemplates has simply never been utilized in the House of Representatives. We are quite literally setting a new precedent that will guide us into the future. Any change of this magnitude should only pass the House with bipartisan consensus, and a 2/3 threshold is appropriate to demonstrate whether or not such a drastic change and new precedent actually meets this test. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record along with the extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question. And with that, Madam Speaker, I urge a no vote on the previous question. I reserve the balance of my time.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, let me just clarify for the record that it only takes a majority to change the rules. Democrats change the rules with a majority. Republicans have changed the rules with a simple majority, not 2/3. I'm now happy to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, an effective and distinguished member of the Rules Committee and of this House, Mr.
Gentleman's
Hastings.
recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chairman. Madam Speaker, we convene today to pass a desperately needed relief package that will provide nearly $3 trillion in economic relief to frontline workers and families, and I'm proud to speak in favor of the rule and in strong support of the underlying legislation, the HEROES Act. Like many of you, I continue to receive emails, letters, and phone calls from constituents bearing the brunt of this administration's disorganized response to the COVID-19 pandemic. My constituents write, and I quote, "I've been denied employment even though I have met every criteria. I'm about to lose everything. Please help me." They write, "I'm homeless. I was just laid off because the schools are closing. I have my granddaughter with me. Please help me." And they write, "I'm literally on my last $100 for food and have already maxed out my credit cards. Please help, please help, please help." Americans are afraid not just of how they're going to make ends meet, but whether they're going to make it through this pandemic at all. Yet this White House remains utterly disconnected from reality, moving at every opportunity to reject science, sideline medical experts, and pat themselves on the back for a job well done, even as the COVID-19 pandemic tears our communities apart. This week, President Trump said that we have prevailed, that we are going to have one of the best years we've ever had, that we are beginning to transition to greatness. The President of the United States refers to over 80,000 dead Americans as a transition to greatness. I wish I could say that I was shocked, but I'm not. What we continue to witness is a catastrophe, and calling it anything less does a great disservice to the millions of Americans who are affected by this illness. If there's to be any silver lining in these trying days, at this exact moment, these public servants are working around the clock to protect us. Madam Speaker, I say to my constituents, we see you.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield such time as I may consume. Just briefly, I want to comment. I want to thank my good friend, distinguished gentleman from Florida, for being here. We all know he is fighting bravely a very deadly disease, and it says a lot about his personal courage, his commitment to service that he's here with us today. Alcee, it's good to have you on the floor of the House, my friend. Thank you. With that, I yield to my good friend, distinguished ranking member of the Education and Labor Committee, the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Fox.
Gentleman is recognized for the amount of time she may consume.
I thank my colleague from Oklahoma for yielding. Today is a dark day in the history of our country, and for that I rise in opposition to HRS 965, partisan legislation that would upend more than 200 years of precedent and jeopardize the deliberative process of the House of Representatives. States have started reopening businesses, schools, and local economies. Congress should be following suit. Yet this is the first time the House has come to semi-regular order in over 2 weeks. Speaker Pelosi and House Democrats are holding the people's house hostage. They would rather erect and prolong a partisan blockade instead of doing the people's business in the open. Members of Congress should not be on the sidelines. We can and should get back to official business, especially committee work. Hearings and markups are a critical function of the people's house. Without passing ill-conceived legislation that jeopardizes our democratic institution, the House proved 2 weeks ago and again today that we can conduct business while following health guidelines. There's no reason congressional committees can't do the same. Sadly, the Democrats are using this pandemic to justify gutting the Constitution and our practices, and it is disgraceful. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, a distinguished member of the Rules Committee, Mr. Perlmutter.
Gentleman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's good to see a Coloradan in the chair. I rise today in support of the rule, the HEROES Act, and HRS 965. I want to start by thanking Chairman McGovern for his leadership, his vision through this Congress, and especially these last difficult months. COVID-19 has affected every corner of our country and the world. The impact of this virus and the blow to our economy is massive, and Congress must act with force and speed. While some of my colleagues may argue we're spending too much money, these packages are a fraction of the losses we've suffered in this country and around the world. I'm proud the HEROES Act includes a provision I introduced with Representative Joe Morelli to provide $500 billion for states to help them to respond to the crisis, to avoid harmful cuts to law enforcement, firefighters, teachers, healthcare, and others, at a time when we can least afford it. The HEROES Act also includes $375 billion provision from fellow Coloradan Joe Neguse for local, county, and municipal governments so they can maintain critical services. Another provision that I worked on is the inclusion of the bipartisan Safe Banking Act to provide legitimate cannabis businesses that are legal under state laws access to banking system. The bill passed this body last fall with 321 votes, including 91 Republicans. Cannabis businesses across the country have been deemed essential during this pandemic, and these businesses and their estimated 243,000 employees deserve equity with other legal businesses. The Safe Banking Act would also address the increased health risk of spreading COVID-19 on banknotes and coins, as well as the increased public safety risk associated with this cash-only industry. At a critical time, safe banking will help protect jobs and encourage lending in our communities.
I urge all my colleagues to support the HEROES Act, and I also encourage them to vote for HRES 965. We had a spirited debate on this yesterday in the Rules Committee, and the fact is we cannot let Congress come to a grinding halt, which is what I think some of my Republican colleagues would like to have us do. I believe it is legislative malpractice if we don't allow for remote voting during this pandemic. Mr. McGovern has acknowledged this as a first step, and I hope we continue discussions and eventually work on a permanent change to the House rules to ensure Congress operates with speed through future emergencies. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 5 minutes to my good friend, distinguished member of the Rules Committee, Mr. Woodall of Georgia.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker and I thank my chairman for yielding. These are strange times. I saw my friend Alcee Hastings on the floor. I wanted to sit down beside him and whisper in his ear like we would have done when we gathered last year. Wanted to grab his hand and tell him I've been praying for him, and now he's gone. Back off the House floor, back into social distancing. No one denies that these are unusual times, even dire times that require substantial response. And in many ways, what we're doing here today isn't unusual. We have a majority in the U.S. House of Representatives that will, in fact, jam through on an almost party line vote its agenda, and that's not unusual. We have a majority in the House that's going to implement its ideas for rules changes in the House, even without a minority amendment. That's not altogether unusual. But I've listened to colleague after colleague come to the House floor and talk about the unusual times that I would argue require an unusual response. I feel a little empty today in what I usually enjoy as a Rules Committee debate. I know how the Rules Committee goes, Madam Speaker. There are 9 members of the majority and 4 members of the minority. The majority wins every vote, and not by a little, by a lot. Your job as a minority member on the Rules Committee is to lose, and you go up there and you lose every day. And that's often the way the House is when we're trying to put together a House position that's going to go into negotiation. But I've heard the sense of urgency that I know each one of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle believe, and our sense of urgency today doesn't allow us time to push a messaging bill across the floor. Madam Speaker, this is the single largest borrow and spend bill the country has ever seen, and it included not one Republican amendment, not one. The single largest rules change the House of Representatives have seen in any of our lifetimes. And the underlying rules change includes not one Republican amendment, not one. I listened to my chairman, for whom I have great respect for. And candidly, the small nature of the Rules Committee, we're able to develop relationships that the entire institution is not able to develop. I wish everybody on the House floor knew the gentleman from Massachusetts as I believe I know the gentleman from Massachusetts. When he talks about fighting hunger, when he talks about us doing better, he's absolutely right and he's absolutely sincere. When he talks about people suffering, when he talks about people in desperate need, he's absolutely right and he's absolutely sincere. When my friend from Florida, Ms. Shalala, talked about she doesn't get calls in her office, she gets cries from desperate people and help. I know that feeling because my office gets the same one. But that's not everything that's in this bill. This bill isn't all testing. This bill isn't all hunger. And I offered an amendment yesterday in the Rules Committee that said, you know what? We're gonna perpetuate the myth that we disagree on everything in this institution in a partisan way. And let's support those things we can support and oppose those things we oppose. Let's support hunger prevention, remediation. Let's support food for children. Let's support testing for first responders. Let's do those things. But, Madam Speaker, as you know, this bill also repeals the SALT tax. It reinstitutes the SALT tax deduction. This is not an idea that's come about in an emergency. This is something we've been arguing about since 2017. This is something the Ways and Means Committee acted on in almost a purely partisan way in December. This is something the House acted on in a purely partisan way in December, long before we were talking about COVID. This is a provision where 80% of Americans, the bottom 80% of all income-earning households, receive 4 cents out of every dollar of this provision.
4 cents to bottom 80% of Americans. The top 5% of Americans, the top 5% of income earners receive 80 cents out of every dollar. It's not an emergency. It's not COVID related. It is not going to the neediest of these. And it's not $1 million provision. It's not $1 billion provision. It's not a $10 billion provision. It is a $200 billion provision tucked into this borrow and spend bill. Madam Speaker, we don't disagree on serving those who need to be served. We don't disagree on medical research. We don't disagree on education. But we do have disagreements. 1,800-page bill offered an amendment to say, let's divide it up into sections so we can support what we can support in a bipartisan way and push through in a partisan way those things that we can't support. It was denied. There are times and places to have partisan debates, Madam Speaker. Today is not one of them.
Madam Speaker, I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
I thank my friend from
Gentleman's recognized for an additional minute.
I thank my friend from Oklahoma. Madam Speaker, we have an opportunity, and not an opportunity that's an untread path as the paths we're on today. We have a well-tread path. I'll remind my colleagues as we fight amongst ourselves on this legislation. We've been to this floor already on COVID-related measures in a bipartisan partnership negotiated way. Not once, not twice, 3 times we've gone down that path. For folks who are watching the debate today, Madam Speaker, I hope they don't take away that we are divided when it comes to supporting our constituency. I hope they don't take away that we're divided when it comes to standing united on behalf of those families that cannot stand for themselves in this tough time. And I hope for my colleagues who feel like they need to push a messaging bill through no matter what, that they remember those times just a few short weeks ago where we came together, where we stood together. Largest change in American history, largest bill, not one Republican amendment.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, on March 1st, Vermont had its lowest unemployment rate in its history. Today, it has its highest unemployment rate in its history. About 1/3 of Vermonters who would like a job can't find a job. The federal government is the only entity that has the fiscal flexibility and the fiscal capacity to meet that need. We have to act. This legislation would provide Vermont with over $2 billion for state and local budgets. Absent that, the pain is going to be pressed down onto our firefighters, our teachers, and our kids. It has reforms to the payroll protection plan so our restaurants and our small businesses have a chance to make use of that, something both sides want to happen. It has $75 billion for testing, which is the path to getting on top of this virus. It provides funds to try to stabilize our institutions of higher education that we must have on the other side of this virus. There's differences, and we don't have the luxury of time for the full debate all of us would prefer. But we must act now. And if we make a mistake in how we proceed, and mistakes will be made, it should be on the side of erring to do too much, not too little. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. May I inquire as to how much time is remaining?
Gentleman from Oklahoma has 3 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Massachusetts has 9 minutes remaining.
I'll reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I'm happy to yield 30 seconds to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of the HEROES Act, which meets urgent needs we are facing in Northern Illinois. This legislation invests in the testing, tracing, and treatment we need to safely reopen our communities. It supports the essential workers whose sacrifices and dedication are keeping us safe. It provides direct funding that will make a critical difference for smaller communities, I am so proud it also includes my bill to eliminate out-of-pocket costs for veterans and to help survivors of domestic violence. This bill is not perfect. We have more work to do, such as ensuring affordable health care coverage for the tens of millions of Americans who find it too expensive. But the HEROES Act will provide relief to all of our communities, and we must pass it today. I yield back.
On this vote, the yeas are 208 and the nays are 199. The HEROES bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purposes does the gentleman from Maryland, the majority leader, rise?
I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for 1 minute, pursuant to the instruction of Ms. Schwanza.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam Speaker, I'm going to be yielding to the Republican whip in just a second, but I will announce the schedule for the weeks to come. As we face the crisis of COVID-19 pandemic, the House must do its duty in full and do so in a way that contributes to the safety and welfare of our people, not in any way that harms it. I want to thank each member of the House for returning to D.C. today to vote on this important legislation. Madam Speaker, members are advised no votes are expected in the House next week. Members are further advised that the House will be in session on Wednesday, May 27th and May 28th. As everyone knows, the Senate has amended the House-passed FISA bill, a very important piece of legislation, which will require the House to act again. I expect that to be considered on the 27th. I also expect conversations to continue on additional legislation addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. The House could vote on COVID-19 related bills on May 27th and 28th.